I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
It was a Tuesday in early March, the kind of day where New York City feels like it's being held together by nothing but grit and bad intentions. The rain was doing that miserable grey drizzle that doesn't quite wash the sidewalk, but manages to soak through a top coat in under 3 minutes. Inside the brownstone, however, the climate was strictly controlled at a level that kept the orchids happy and Nero Wolfe's temper at a simmer rather than a boil. Wolfe was in the plant rooms for his morning session, which left me at my desk in the office, wondering if I could find a way to justify a trip to the corner for a sandwich without admitting I was bored enough to count the stamps in the drawer. The silence was broken not by the doorbell, but by a sound far more offensive to Wolfe's ears, the heavy, rhythmic thumping of someone who didn't know how to use the brass knocker properly. I went to the door, checked the peephole, and saw a man who looked like he had been put together using parts from 3 different rummage sales. He was elderly, wearing a tweed jacket that had seen the Truman administration and holding a leather satchel as if it contained the secret to eternal life. I opened the door 6 inches. If you're selling encyclopedias, we already have several sets, and Mr. Wolfe has opinions on the alphabet that would only hurt your feelings. The man didn't blink. His eyes were a startling, intelligent blue behind glasses as thick as the bottom of a milk bottle. I am Arthur Pym. Not the Poe character, though the resemblance to a ghost is becoming more pronounced by the hour. I own, or rather I am the curator of the forgotten bookshop on 4th Avenue. I need to see Mr. Wolfe. It is a matter of bibliographical life and death. We're a private detective agency, Mr. Pym, not a literary rescue mission, I said, though I found myself opening the door the rest of the way. There was a frantic scholarly dignity about him that usually interested Wolfe, provided it came with a retainer. I am aware of what you are, Mr. Goodwin, Pym said, stepping into the hall and leaving a trail of damp tweed, and I am aware of Mr. Wolfe's library. That is precisely why I am here. Someone is stealing the history of this city, 1 page at a time, and I believe the next page to be torn out is mine. I led him into the office, just as the elevator groaned to a halt. Wolfe emerged, his 280 pounds of genius and irritability encased in a silk dressing gown of a particularly aggressive yellow. He moved to his chair, settled in with a sigh that sounded like a collapsing building, and fixed Pym with a gaze that could have withered a cactus. I do not see visitors before lunch without an appointment, Archie. Mr. Pym here says he's from the forgotten bookshop, I said, leaning against my desk. He's worried about someone stealing history. I thought it sounded like a change of pace from the usual insurance frauds. Wolfe's eyes flickered toward Pym, the forgotten bookshop, 4th Avenue, specializing in pre-revolutionary New York ephemera and the personal journals of minor Dutch officials. Your collection of Van der Donk's correspondence is, I believe, unparalleled. Pym's face transformed. The frantic energy softened into a smile of pure academic recognition. It was unparalleled, Mr. Wolfe, until last Thursday when the correspondence was removed from its locked casing without the lock being broken. And yesterday a map of the Manassas settlement, dated 1639, was replaced by a clever lithograph. The police call it a series of unfortunate misplacements. I call it an intellectual assassination. Wolfe leaned back, his fingers steeled over his center of gravity. A thief who understands the value of a 1639 map, but replaces it with a lithograph, is not a common thief. He is a collector with a conscience, or a predator with a plan. Why come to me? Surely your insurance company has adjusters for such things. Pym leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. It is not about the money, Mr. Wolfe. It is about a specific ledger, the ledger of the 5. It was hidden in the shop's basement vault, a vault only 3 people have access to. It contains the true names of the original landholders of Lower Manhattan, not the names on the deeds, but the names of those who actually held the debt. If that ledger is made public, or worse, destroyed, several of the most prominent families in this city will find their genealogies and their land claims dissolving into thin air. I watched Wolfe. I knew that look. He wasn't interested in the families or the land claims, but he was very interested in the idea of a secret ledger hidden in a basement vault being manipulated by a thief with a sense of irony. "You mentioned a bibliographical life and death," Wolfe said, his voice now a low, resonant rumble. "Who is threatened?" "I am," Pym said simply. "I received a note this morning. It said that if I did not provide the combination to the secondary internal safe by midnight tomorrow, the shop would be cleansed." And by cleansed they mean burned. Wolfe's jaw tightened. The destruction of a book was to him a crime far more heinous than the destruction of a man. He sat in silence for a long moment, the only sound the ticking of the clock and the faint hiss of the rain against the window. "Archie," Wolfe said, not looking at me, "take a record of Mr. Pym's associates, the 3 individuals with access to the vault, and tell Fritz to prepare the guest room. Mr. Pym will be staying with us until this matter of cleansing is addressed. I will not have a library burned while I am capable of thought." Pym looked relieved, but I looked at the calendar. We were officially taking a case based on a threat to a pile of old paper. "Retainer, sir?" I asked. "Mr. Pym will provide a list of his most recent acquisitions in lieu of a cash advance," Wolfe said. "I believe he recently came into possession of a first edition of the Federalist Papers with handwritten annotations by J. That will suffice for the opening of the account." I sighed and reached for my notepad. The brownstone was about to be filled with the dust of centuries, and I had a feeling I'd be the one doing the dusting. A breach of the threshold occurred precisely at 2 o'clock the following afternoon. By then, Arthur Pym was tucked away in the guest room on the 3rd floor, likely alphabetizing the wallpaper, while Wolfe was in the plant rooms. I had spent the morning trying to figure out how a man like Pym kept a shop on 4th Avenue open in this economy, let alone one containing a vault that made the city's blue blood sweat. The answer arrived in the form of 3 people who looked like they had been sent by a casting director looking for academic anxiety. I showed them into the office. The air in the room immediately changed from its usual scent of old leather and beer to something more pointed. Expensive perfume, stale tobacco, and the sharp ozone smell of someone who had just stepped out of a high-end sedan. First was Julian Sterling, a man whose suit cost more than my car, and whose face looked like it had been carved out of a very expensive piece of soap. He was the silent partner in Pym's shop, the kind of man who provided the capital so he could brag about owning a piece of history at cocktail parties. Next was Evelyn Thorne, Pym's chief cataloguer. She was 40-ish, with ink-stained fingers and eyes that darted around the office as if she were looking for a misplaced footnote. Bringing up the rear was a younger man, Marcus Crane, a research fellow who looked like he hadn't slept since the invention of the printing press. "Mr. Wolfe is currently occupied," I said, leaning against my desk and giving them my most professional don't-try-anything smile. "I'm Archie Goodwin. You're here because Mr. Pym is worried about his shop, and by extension, his health. Since you 3 are the only ones with the vault combination, I thought we might have a little chat about who likes fire and who likes old ledgers." Sterling didn't sit. He stood by the window, looking out at the rain as if it were a personal insult. "This is absurd. Arthur is a melodramatic old fool. He's been seeing ghosts in the stacks for years. To drag us here to a private investigator's house because of a missing map and a few notes, it's bad for the shop's reputation." "Bad for the reputation or bad for the portfolio?" I asked. Pym mentioned the ledger of the 5. That sounds like the kind of thing that could make a reputation go up in smoke along with the building. Evelyn Thorne sat on the edge of the red leather chair, her hands knotting together. "It's not just a map, Julian. The Monatas settlement map was a primary source. Its disappearance is a tragedy, and Marcus found the note in the basement. It wasn't Arthur's imagination." Marcus Crane nodded, his voice a low, nervous rasp. I found it tucked into a copy of the American Gazetteer. It was typed on a manual machine, an old Remington by the look of the typeface. It was quite specific about the cleansing. I didn't think we had a choice but to find Arthur. The elevator groaned and the master of the house made his entrance. Wolfe stepped into the room, his eyes sweeping over the trio with a lack of enthusiasm that was almost impressive. He didn't offer a hand or a greeting. He simply crossed to his chair and let his bulk settle into the custom-made springs. He spent a good 30 seconds adjusting his blotter before looking up. "You are here," Wolfe said, his voice a dry rumble, "because you are the only individuals capable of entering Mr. Pym's vault without resorting to explosives. One of you is a thief, perhaps all three of you are collaborators. The ledger of the five is an object of immense political and social leverage. I intend to discover which of you has prioritized that leverage over the sanctity of Mr. Pym's collection." Sterling turned from the window, his lip curling. "You have no authority to keep us here, Wolfe, and you certainly have no authority to accuse us of theft. I am the primary financier of that shop. Why would I steal from myself? Ownership," Wolfe said, "is a legal fiction. Control is the reality. You may own the paper, Mr. Sterling, but you do not necessarily control the secrets written upon it. A man in your position might find it more profitable to suppress certain histories than to preserve them. Or perhaps Miss Thorne, whose expertise allows her to distinguish a lithograph from an original with ease, decided that her knowledge was worth more than her salary." Evelyn Thorne flushed deep red. "I have spent 15 years protecting those books. I wouldn't dream of—" "And Mr. Crane," Wolfe interrupted, shifting his gaze to the young researcher, "the discoverer of the threatening note. A convenient role. The man who sounds the alarm is often the one who set the fire." The room was suddenly very small and very tense. Sterling looked like he wanted to call his lawyer. Evelyn looked like she wanted to cry, and Marcus looked like he wanted to disappear into the floorboards. I stood by the door, watching the play of expressions. Wolfe wasn't looking for a confession yet. He was stirring the pot to see what floated to the surface. "I will not tolerate arson," Wolfe said, his voice dropping an octave. "And I will not tolerate the destruction of the ledger. You will remain in this city, available to Mr. Goodwin, until this matter is concluded. Archie, ensure their contact information is verified, and then show them out. Their presence is beginning to interfere with my digestion." I did as I was told, noting the way Sterling's jaw was set and the way Marcus Crane's hands were shaking as he handed me a card. As the front door closed behind them, the brownstone felt quieter, but the air was still heavy with the suspicion they'd left behind. I walked back into the office. "Well," I said, "that went well. Sterling thinks you're a charlatan, Evelyn thinks you're a monster, and Marcus thinks you're going to put him in the electric chair. Which one is our man?" Wolfe didn't answer. He was staring at the empty space where they had stood, his fingers tapping a rhythmic, thoughtful pattern on the arm of his chair. "They are all lying, Archie, but they are lying about different things. Sterling is lying about his motives, Miss Thorne is lying about her discoveries, and Mr. Crane is lying about his fear. We must find the common thread that ties them to the vault. Start with the Forgotten Shop's basement. I want to know what else is missing that Mr. Pym hasn't noticed yet." I nodded, grabbing my hat. It was time for a little field work, and I had a feeling the basement of a 4th Avenue bookshop was going to be even more depressing than the rain outside. The following morning, the rain had traded its heavy drumming for a persistent, needle-like mist that seemed determined to find the gaps in my collar. I left Wolfe to his 4 hours of horticultural bliss with the orchids and headed down to 4th Avenue. The Forgotten Bookshop was tucked between a dusty upholstery repair shop and a storefront that appeared to sell nothing but disappointment. From the outside, it looked like a place where time went to take a nap and forgot to wake up. The windows were piled high with yellowed folios and maps that had been drawn when most of the Western world was still labelled "Here be dragons." I used the key Arthur Pym had provided and stepped inside. The air was a thick, dry soup of decomposing paper, glue, and a hint of peppermint, likely Pym's attempt to battle the smell of the centuries. I navigated through the labyrinth of floor-to-ceiling shelves, heading for the rear where a heavy iron door led to the basement. As I descended the creaking wooden stairs, the temperature dropped and the peppermint vanished, replaced by the damp, metallic scent of a tomb. The basement wasn't just a storage room, it was a fortress. The vault door was a massive slab of steel that looked like it belonged in the basement of the Federal Reserve. I spent an hour poking around the periphery, looking for any signs of forced entry that Pym might have missed. There were none, no scratches on the dial, no pry marks on the frame. Whoever was taking the history of New York had a key or the combination, which meant it was an inside job, just as Wolfe had surmised. I turned my attention to the bibliophile's circle, the small, cluttered office where Evelyn Thorne and Marcus Crane spent their days. It was a space no larger than a walk-in closet, crammed with 2 desks and enough filing cabinets to stop a tank. I started with Evelyn's desk. It was unnervingly neat. Her pens were lined up like soldiers, and her blotter was pristine. I did a quick survey of her drawers and found a stash of correspondence from a high-end auction house in London. It seemed our ink-stained cataloguer was in the habit of inquiring about the market value of items that sounded remarkably similar to the ones missing from the vault. Marcus Crane's desk was the opposite, a chaotic mountain of notes, half-empty coffee cups and scraps of parchment. Amidst the mess, I found a small leather-bound notebook hidden inside a hollowed-out copy of a 19th-century geography text. I flipped through it and felt a whistle forming in my teeth. It wasn't research, it was a map of his own. Crane had been tracing the lineages of the families mentioned in the Ledger of the Five, not for historical curiosity but for their current addresses and financial standings. There were names in that notebook that appeared on the front pages of the Social Register every Sunday. I was about to dig deeper when I heard a floorboard groan above me. I froze, hand resting on the notebook, and waited. The sound didn't repeat. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that feels like someone is holding their breath just out of sight. I moved to the stairs, light on my feet, and caught a glimpse of a shadow retreating toward the front of the shop. I didn't give chase. In a place this cramped, a pursuit usually ends with someone getting buried under a ton of Dutch history. Instead, I finished my sweep. In a corner behind a stack of shipping crates, I found something that hadn't been mentioned in Pym's inventory. It was a typewriter, an old Remington manual, just like the one Marcus had described. I rolled a piece of scrap paper into the carriage and typed out a single sentence, "The cleansing is near." The E was slightly raised and the N was faint on the bottom right. I tucked the sample into my pocket and headed back to the surface. I made one more stop before returning to the brownstone. I dropped by a small, quiet bar near Gramercy Park, where I knew a certain researcher for a title insurance company liked to take his lunch. $10 and a 20-minute conversation later, I had a bit of context. It turned out Julian Sterling's private investment in the Bookshop wasn't just a hobby. His family's firm was currently involved in a massive land use dispute in Lower Manhattan, a dispute that could be settled instantly if the original Dutch landholder records ever surfaced. The Ledger of the Five wasn't just a dusty book, it was a multi-million-dollar wrecking ball. By the time I got back to West 35th Street, Wolfe was down from the plant rooms and settled into his chair, waiting for his beer. I gave him the full report, laying out the auction letters, the hidden notebook, and the typewriter sample. I didn't leave out the shadow in the shop either. "So," I said, leaning against the corner of his desk, "we've got a cataloguer who's checking prices, a researcher who's stalking the rich and famous, and a financier who's looking to bulldoze history to make room for a skyscraper. And someone is playing ghost in the basement with a typewriter that belongs to the shop. It's a regular 3-ring circus, only with more dust." Wolfe didn't look at the evidence. He sat with his eyes closed, his chest rising and falling in the slow rhythmic cadence that meant his brain was doing 60 miles an hour while his body was parked. He reached out a hand, found his glass of beer, and took a sip before speaking. The shadow, Archie. Was it heavy or light? Light, I said, quiet as a cat, definitely not sterling in his bench-made brogues. The letters to the auction house are a distraction, Wolfe murmured. Miss Thorne is ambitious, but she is also a professional. She would know that selling stolen, unique items to a major house is an act of suicide. No, she is being used as a shield, and Mr. Crane's notebook is too visible, even in its hiding place. It is a performance of guilt. The tension in that basement is not the result of a single thief, but of 3 people each trying to outmaneuver the other while a 4th party orchestrates the music. He opened his eyes and looked at the typewriter sample. The note was typed on that machine, but by someone who wanted it found. We are being led, Archie. Tomorrow you will pay a visit to the families Mr. Crane so carefully noted. I want to know if any of them have been approached with an offer of historical insurance. We must find out who is selling the silence that the ledger provides. I nodded, feeling the familiar prickle of a case tightening up. The bibliophile circle was widening, and I had a feeling the next stop would involve a lot more than just dusty shelves. Wednesday arrived with the sky the color of a bruised plum and a wind that wanted to peel the paint off the brownstone. Wolfe was upstairs with Theodore and the orchids, leaving me to handle the sidewalk side of the business. Following the trail in Marcus Crane's notebook was like playing a high-stakes game of connect the dots through the social register. I spent the morning in the back of the sedan, bouncing between the limestone fortresses of the Upper East Side and the discreet, ivy-covered townhouses of Gramercy Park. My goal was to see if any of the city's old guard families had been receiving the kind of mail that doesn't usually come with a return address. My first stop was the residence of Peter Stuyvesant Vane, a man whose ancestors had probably complained about the quality of the mud on Broadway in 1650. I managed to get past the butler by looking like I was there to audit something important and boring. Vane was a tall, skeletal man who sat in a room full of portraits of other skeletal men. He wasn't interested in a detective until I mentioned the forgotten bookshop and the ledger of the 5. The change in his face was subtle, a tightening of the jaw that usually means someone just found a fly in their soup. I have no interest in the ramblings of Arthur Pym, Vane said, his voice as dry as parchment. The history of this city is well documented in the proper channels. Private ledgers are often little more than repositories for ancient gossip and clerical errors. Sure, I said, looking at a portrait that looked like it wanted to bite me. But someone thinks those clerical errors are worth a lot of money. Has anyone offered to sell you a piece of that history lately? Maybe a guarantee that certain family branches stay pruned and private. Vane stood up, the interview over before I'd even sat down. Good day, Mr. Goodwin. If I wanted to discuss fiction, I'd hire a novelist. I got a similar reception at 2 more houses. The old money in New York doesn't talk to strangers, especially strangers who ask about their great-great-great-grandfather's debts. But at the 3rd stop, the Van Horn mansion, the wall cracked just a little. The youngest daughter, a sharp-eyed woman named Clara, caught me at the door. "You're the one asking about the ledger," she said, her voice low. "My father won't talk to you, but you should know he's been terrified for a month. A man came here, not Arthur Pym, someone younger, very polished. He didn't ask for money, he asked for access. He wanted my father to use his influence on the zoning board for a certain development project in Lower Manhattan. In exchange, he offered to return an original document that proves our family's primary landholding was actually a lease that expired in 1890. I felt the pieces start to click. Did he give a name? He called himself the librarian, she said with a faint, bitter smile. He knew things about our family history that even I didn't know. He was arrogant, Archie. He behaved as if he already owned the city and was just waiting for the paperwork to catch up. I thanked her and headed back to the brownstone, the mist turning into a steady freezing rain. I had enough to know that Julian Sterling's involvement was deeper than just a financial stake in a bookshop. He wasn't just looking to protect his own land. He was using the ledger as a lever to move the entire city's real estate market. But Sterling wasn't the librarian. Sterling was a hammer, and the man Clara described was a scalpel. When I got back to West 35th Street, I found Wolfe in the office, staring at a map of the 1639 Manatas settlement I'd managed to borrow from a contact at the Historical Society. He didn't look up as I gave him the rundown on Vane, the Van Horns, and the mysterious librarian. "Access," Wolfe murmured, his eyes tracking the old Dutch boundaries. "A sophisticated blackmail. Not a demand for cash, which is traceable and finite, but a demand for influence, which is expansive and enduring. The librarian is not merely a thief, he is a social engineer, and he's using Sterling's money to do it," I added, sitting at my desk. "Sterling gets the land cleared for his skyscrapers, and the librarian gets a seat at the table with the most powerful men in the city. But who is he? He knows the shop, he knows the vault, and he knows the families better than they know themselves." Wolfe finally looked at me. "He is someone who has spent years in the silence of those stacks, Archie. Someone who has read the margins as well as the text. Marcus Crane has the research skills, but he lacks the polish Clara Van Horn described. Julian Sterling has the polish, but he lacks the patience for the dust. Evelyn Thorne has the knowledge, but her ambition is focused on the market, not the boardrooms. So we're looking for a ghost who isn't a ghost," I said. "Pym's circle is too small. There has to be a fourth person. There is always a fourth person, Archie. The one who isn't mentioned in the inventory. Tell me, when you were in the basement, did you notice the shipping crates? Specifically the ones marked for the Empire Preservation Society." I thought back to the cluttered corner near the typewriter. Yeah. There were 3 of them, stuffed with Excelsior and looking like they hadn't been moved in a year. "They have been moved," Wolfe said, a faint note of triumph in his voice. "I had Saul Panzer do a little digging while you were playing the socialite. The Empire Preservation Society has no office, no staff, and only one member on record, a Dr. Thomas Finch, a man who supposedly died 5 years ago but whose signature appeared on a delivery receipt for Pym's shop only last month. We are dealing with a man who has erased himself from the present to better manipulate the past." I leaned back, the chill from the rain finally reaching my bones. A dead man stealing the secrets of the dead. It's a nice touch, but how does he get into the vault? "He's not one of the 3. He doesn't need to be," Wolfe said, his eyes narrowing. "If you can't open the door, you simply wait for someone else to do it and then take what you want while they are looking the other way. Or you convince them that the door is already open. Tomorrow, Archie, we shall invite our friends back. I want to see how they react when the dead start to speak." I nodded, checking my 38. The legwork was done and the circle was closing, but I had a feeling that the librarian wasn't going to go back into the stacks without a fight. The following morning, the brownstone was wrapped in a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. Wolfe had retired to the plant rooms at his usual hour, and Arthur Pym was still upstairs, presumably buried under a mountain of historical transcripts I'd fetched for him to keep his mind off the impending cleansing of his shop. I was in the office, trying to make sense of the Dr. Thomas Finch lead, when the first sign of a subtle trespass made itself known. It wasn't a broken window or a jimmied lock. It was something far more unnerving in a house where every object had a designated coordinate. I had gone to the kitchen to fetch a fresh bottle of milk for my coffee. When I returned, I noticed the heavy glass paperweight on Wolfe's desk, a souvenir from a case involving a disgruntled glassblower in Murano, had been moved exactly 2 inches to the left. To anyone else, it was a non-event. To me, it was a flare in the dark. Wolfe's desk was sacred. Not even Fritz touched the items on that blotter without a direct order. I checked the drawers. Everything looked intact until I reached the small, discreet compartment where I kept the typewriter sample from the bookshop. The envelope was there, but the flap was tucked in differently. I pulled out the paper. It was the same sheet, but someone had added a line beneath my test sentence. In the same erratic, raised-E typeface of the shop's Remington, it now read, "The past is a heavy burden for a house this old." I didn't call for Wolfe. I went through the house like a cat on a hot griddle. I checked the front door, the back service entrance and the basement windows. All were bolted. The chain was still on the door. No one had entered or exited through the normal channels. I checked the guest room. Pim was sound asleep, his snoring a rhythmic reassurance that he wasn't my intruder. I went to the kitchen. Fritz was busy with the midday preparations, and he swore on his copper pots that no one had passed through his domain. The trespass was a message. It was the librarian letting us know that the walls of the brownstone were as porous as the stacks of a Fourth Avenue bookshop. It was a psychological jab, designed to rattle Wolfe's composure. When Wolfe came down at 11, I didn't say a word until he was settled and had his first beer in hand. I simply pointed to the paperweight and then handed him the updated typewriter sample. Wolfe didn't explode. He didn't even grunt. He looked at the paper for a long time, his eyes narrowing until there were just slits in his massive face. He touched the paperweight, moving it back to its original position with a surgical precision. "The audacity of the scholar," Wolfe murmured, his voice a low, dangerous hum. "To invade this room is not merely a crime of property, Archie. It is an assault on the mind. He is telling us that our fortress is a fiction." "He didn't break in, sir," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "I was in the kitchen for 5 minutes. Either he's a ghost, or he's been here the whole time." "He is not a ghost, and he is not in the house," Wolfe said, his fingers beginning their rhythmic tapping on the arm of his chair. "He used the one avenue we failed to secure because we deemed it beneath notice. The service lift for the coal chute. It leads to the basement, and the lock is a simple lever that can be manipulated from the outside with a bit of wire and patience." "He didn't come for the ledger, Archie. He came to see if I was as formidable as the rumors suggest." "Well, he left a calling card," I said. "What's the next move? If he can get in here, he can get to Pim." Wolfe shook his head. "Mr. Pim is of no interest to him now. Pim is the past. We are the present obstacle. The librarian, or Dr. Finch, if we are to use his discarded name, is escalating. He has realized that we have connected him to the Empire Preservation Society. He is no longer playing for access. He is playing for survival." Wolfe reached out and rang the bell for Fritz. When Fritz appeared, Wolfe didn't ask about lunch. "Fritz, I want the basement secured. Bolted from the inside with a temporary bar across the coal chute. And Archie, call Saul Panzer. I want him stationed at the end of the block. If anyone so much as pauses to look at our numbers, I want to know the color of their eyes." The rest of the day was a study in heightened tension. The brownstone, usually a place of predictable comforts, felt suddenly drafty. Every creak of the floorboards, every rattle of the windows in the March wind, seemed like a footstep. Pim came down for tea, looking more haggard than ever. He sensed the change in the atmosphere but couldn't put a finger on it. Is there word from the shop?" he asked, his voice trembling as he reached for a scone. "The shop is fine, Arthur," Wolfe said, his tone unusually gentle, "but the ledger is no longer the primary concern. We are now dealing with a man who believes he can edit reality as easily as he edits a manuscript. He has made the mistake of trying to edit this house." As night fell, the pressure increased. Another clue arrived, not by hand, but through the mail slot. A small, brown paper package, addressed to Wolfe in that same distinctive typeface. I opened it at the desk while Wolfe watched from his chair. Inside was a single charred page from a ledger. It wasn't the ledger of the 5, but it was an old record of some kind. Across the blackened paper, someone had written in white ink, "Everything burns eventually. Even the truth." Wolfe looked at the charred scrap, and for the first time in years, I saw a flash of genuine anger in his eyes. It wasn't the cold, calculated anger he used for suspects. It was a deep, burning resentment. "He is threatening the books, Archie," Wolfe whispered. "He thinks the threat of fire will compel me to silence. He does not realize that for me, the preservation of the word is the only absolute. Call Sterling, Thorne, and Crane. Tell them to be here at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Tell them the ledger is in this office, and the final accounting is due. If the librarian wants the truth, he will have to come into the light to take it." I went to the phone, my heart thumping a bit faster. Wolfe was setting the bait, but he was using himself and the brownstone as the trap. It was a grandmaster's move, but in a game where the opponent likes to play with matches, it felt like a very dangerous way to spend a Thursday. By Thursday night, the atmosphere inside the brownstone was as thick as a London fog and twice as cold. The subtle trespass with the paperweight had been a psychological opening, but the charred page delivered through the mail slot was a declaration of war. Wolfe had retreated into a state of monumental stillness, his eyes fixed on the blackened scrap of history as if he could force the ashes to reform into an indictment. I spent the evening making sure the house was locked down tighter than a drum. I checked the coal chute bar myself, then went up to the roof to ensure the skylights were bolted. Outside, the street was a tableau of urban isolation. From the front window, I could see Saul Panzer leaning against a lamp-post a half-block down, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, looking like just another weary New Yorker waiting for a bus that wasn't coming. But I knew Saul. He was recording every license plate and memorizing every face that turned into our street. Every 20 minutes he'd give a sharp, nearly invisible nod to the house, his way of telling me the perimeter was holding. Around 10 o'clock the phone rang. It wasn't the suspects, it was a voice that sounded like it had been filtered through a graveyard, soft, cultured, and entirely devoid of heat. "Mr. Goodwin," the voice said, "I trust the charred remains reached Mr. Wolfe's desk. It is a mere preface. The ledger of the 5 is currently being moved. If Mr. Wolfe persists in his invitation for tomorrow morning, the original will be reduced to carbon before his guests arrive. Tell him that some histories are meant to be forgotten." "You must be the librarian," I said, signaling Wolfe to pick up the extension. "You've got a lot of nerve calling this house. We don't care much for your editorial style, and your delivery service leaves a lot to be desired." There was a faint, dry chuckle on the other end. Mr. Wolfe's vanity is his weakness. He believes his intellect can preserve what time has already condemned. Tomorrow at 9, he will be holding an empty box, and I will be holding the matches. Good night, Archie. The line went dead. Wolfe replaced his receiver with a deliberate slow motion. He didn't look rattled. He looked like a man who had just seen his opponent move a pawn and realized it opened the way for a checkmate. "Vanity," he says, Wolfe murmured, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. He mistakes a commitment to the integrity of the record for a personal indulgence. He is moving the ledger, Archie, which means he finally has it. The map, the correspondence, the lithograph, they were all diversions to keep Pym distracted while he worked on the secondary safe. "But if he has it, why the phone call?" I asked. "If I had the loot, I'd be halfway to Jersey by now." "Because he doesn't just want the book," Wolfe said, his fingers beginning their rhythmic tapping. "He wants the validation. He wants me to admit that he has won. He is a man who has lived in the shadows of other men's thoughts for too long. He requires an audience for his triumph. That is why he will show up tomorrow, not as a guest but as the master of the revelation." The pressure increased as the clock ticked toward midnight. I didn't sleep. I stayed in the office watching the street through the slats of the blinds. Around 2 in the morning, a dark sedan cruised slowly past the house. It didn't stop, but the brake lights flared briefly as it passed our door. I signaled Saul. A few minutes later he called. "The car is registered to a defunct shell company," Saul reported, his voice crisp. "But the driver, I caught a glimpse of him when he slowed down. It was Marcus Crane. He looked like he was about to jump out of his skin. He's been around the block 3 times in the last hour, Archie. He's either keeping watch or he's trying to work up the nerve to knock." "Let him circle," I said. "Wolfe wants the whole cast here at 9. If he wants in early, he can talk to the curb." By 7, the morning light was a sickly yellow, filtering through a sky that promised more sleet. Fritz was in the kitchen, his face set in a grim mask as he prepared breakfast. Not that anyone had an appetite. Arthur Pym came down, looking like he'd aged a decade overnight. He sat in the dining room staring into a cup of tea he didn't drink. "The note," Pym whispered when I walked in. "The midnight deadline has passed. My shop, my life's work." "The shop is still standing, Arthur," I said, though I didn't mention the charred page. "Wolfe is taking the podium in 2 hours. Just keep your chin up and your ears open." The final clue of the morning arrived at 8:30. It wasn't a package or a call. It was a realization. I was checking the office again when I noticed a small white smudge on the edge of the red leather chair where Evelyn Thorne had sat. I leaned down and touched it. It was chalk, white, fine-grained chalk. It wasn't there yesterday. I looked at the floor and saw a faint trail of the stuff leading toward the bookshelves. I followed it to the section on New York history. Tucked behind a volume of Valentine's manual was a small brass key. It wasn't a key to the brownstone. It was a key to a locker, the kind you find at Grand Central. "The librarian isn't just a scholar, Archie," Wolfe said from the doorway, watching me hold up the key. "He is a playwright. He has provided us with the location of the ledger, but only after ensuring that his audience is assembled. He is inviting us to a race he believes we have already lost. But he has forgotten one thing: in this house, I determine the pace of the narrative." I pocketed the key, my adrenaline finally kicking in. The stage was set, the suspects were on their way, and the librarian was poised to make his move. It was time for the final accounting, and I had a feeling the office was about to become the most dangerous room in Manhattan. The morning light was a dismal thin wash that did nothing to warm the office as 9 o'clock approached. Wolfe had abandoned his yellow silk for a dark, somber wool that made him look like a high-altitude judge. He sat behind his desk, not moving, not even to reach for the letter opener. He was a mountain of silent expectation. I had placed the brass key I found behind the Valentine's manual on the center of the blotter, where it sat like an unexploded shell. Pym was in his usual chair, looking as though he might crumble into a pile of dry parchment if the wind shifted. The guests arrived with a punctuality that spoke of desperation rather than politeness. Julian Sterling was first, his face a mask of cold arrogance that couldn't quite hide the way his eyes kept darting toward the desk. Evelyn Thorne followed, her ink-stained fingers twisting a damp handkerchief. Marcus Crane was the last to enter, his breathing shallow and his skin the color of old library paste. I noted that his shoes were damp, matching the trail I'd seen Saul Panzer report from his early morning surveillance. Wolfe waited until they were all seated, the tension in the room tightening like a piano wire. He didn't look at them, he looked at the brass key. "We are assembled," Wolfe began, his voice a low, resonant boom that seemed to vibrate the very floorboards. "We are here to witness the conclusion of a play that has been written in the margins of a Fourth Avenue bookshop. One of you believes that by the end of this hour, you will walk out of this house with the future of this city's elite tucked under your arm. You believe that history is merely a tool for the highest bidder." Sterling leaned forward, his voice a sharp blade. "Enough with the theatrics, Wolfe. You summoned us here saying the ledger was in this room. All I see is a cheap locker key and a lot of expensive talk. My firm has millions at stake in the lower Manhattan development, and I won't have my time wasted by a man who plays with orchids while the world moves on." "The world moves on, Mr. Sterling, but it leaves footprints," Wolfe said, his eyes finally lifting to meet the financiers. "You provided the capital for the theft, believing you were buying a clean slate for your skyscrapers. But you are a clumsy predator. You hired a man who is far more dangerous than you are. A man who understands that a ledger is not just a list of names, but a leash. You thought you were the master, but you are merely the patron." Wolfe turned his gaze to Evelyn Thorne. "And you, Miss Thorne, you provided the access. You were the one who noticed the lithograph because you were the one who placed it there. You believed that by helping to dismantle Pym's collection, you could finally afford to open a shop of your own. You are the pragmatist of the group, but your pragmatism blinded you to the fact that you were working for a ghost." Evelyn's face went white. I only wanted what was fair. Arthur is old, he doesn't understand the market. Justice is not a market, madam, Wolfe snapped. He then looked at Marcus Crane. And you, Mr. Crane, the man in the dark sedan, the man who spent his nights circling this house, waiting for a signal that never came. You are the researcher. You found the secrets, but you lacked the stomach to use them. You are the one who left the chalk trail, a desperate attempt to absolve yourself by leading us to a locker that you know is empty. Marcus let out a strangled sob. He forced me. He said if I didn't help him edit the records, he'd make sure I never worked in a library again. He knows everything, Mr. Wolfe. He's not human, he's a collector of souls. He is a man, Wolfe said, his voice dropping to a whisper that filled the room. A man named Thomas Finch, who has spent 5 years in the basement of that shop, living in the crates you thought were full of Excelsior. He did not die 5 years ago. He merely removed himself from the senses to better study the weaknesses of the living, and he is here now. I moved toward the door, my hand on the .38 in my holster, but Wolfe waved me back. He wasn't looking at the door. He was looking at the bookshelves behind Sterling. The librarian, Wolfe said, does not enter through the front door when he can occupy the architecture itself. He has been in the house since he used the coal chute yesterday. He is behind the fake panel in the New York history section, a panel I had installed for my own privacy and which he discovered during his subtle trespass. The room went dead silent. Then, with a slow grinding click, a section of the shelving swung outward. A man stepped out. He was thin, almost translucent, with hair as white as the chalk I'd found and eyes that seemed to have seen through the back of every book ever written. He wasn't carrying a weapon. He was carrying a small leather-bound volume, the Ledger of the Five. An impressive deduction, Mr. Wolfe, the man said, his voice the same graveyard filter I'd heard on the phone. But as I told Archie, vanity is your weakness. You've trapped me in a room, but I hold the only thing that matters. If anyone moves, this ledger goes into the fire, and with it, the truth of this city's foundation. Wolfe didn't move. He didn't even look surprised. He simply picked up his beer and took a slow, deliberate sip. The fire is already out, Mr. Finch. Archie, show the gentleman the brass key again. I held it up. Finch looked at it, his eyes narrowing. That key, Wolfe said, is not for a locker at Grand Central. It is the key to the secondary lock on the coal chute, which Archie installed an hour ago. You are not holding the ledger, Mr. Finch. You are holding a very clever facsimile that Mr. Pym prepared for me last night while you were busy hiding in the walls. The real ledger is currently in the hands of the district attorney. You didn't steal the history, sir. You merely stole a very long, very detailed trap. Finch looked down at the book in his hands, his face contorting into a mask of pure academic rage. The Grandmaster had made his move, and the librarian was finally out of the stacks. The office was suddenly a theatre of the absurd, with the librarian standing paralyzed by the weight of a counterfeit history. Thomas Finch, or the man who had stolen that name from a headstone, gripped the facsimile ledger so tightly his knuckles resembled polished ivory. Julian Sterling was halfway out of his chair, his face a fluctuating shade of purple, while Evelyn Thorne had collapsed back into her seat, the handkerchief in her hands now a shredded ruin. Marcus Crane simply stared at the floor, his shoulders shaking with the quiet rhythm of a man who had finally reached the end of his tether. Wolfe did not gloat. He sat with his hands resting on the arms of his chair, the picture of monumental patience. He waited for the silence to become a burden, for the reality of their failure to settle into the marrow of their bones. "Be seated, Mr. Finch," Wolfe said, his voice as heavy as a tombstone. "The book you hold is a masterwork of Mr. Pym's craft, ink aged with tea, paper scorched with precision, and names transcribed from a Victorian phone directory. It is as hollow as your ambitions. The actual ledger of the Five has been out of this house for 3 hours. It is currently being processed by men who care very little for the sanctity of the stacks and a great deal about the laws of the state of New York." Finch didn't sit. He looked at the book, then at Wolfe, and finally at the fireplace. For a second I thought he might toss the fake into the embers just for the spite of it, but he simply let his arms drop to his sides. He looked less like a mastermind now and more like a moth that had been pinned to a board. "You knew," Finch whispered. "From the moment the paperweight was moved." "I knew long before that," Wolfe said. "The error you made was one of scale. You believed that by controlling the past you could dictate the future. But history is not a static document, it is a living process. When you removed yourself from the world 5 years ago, you lost the ability to understand human impulse. You treated Mr. Sterling as a pocketbook, Miss Thorne as a locksmith, and Mr. Crane as a scribe. You forgot that people are volatile. They leave chalk on chairs, they send letters to auction houses, and they circle houses in dark sedans when their conscience begins to itch." Wolfe shifted his gaze to Julian Sterling. "Now, sir, let us discuss your role. You provided the financing for this Empire Preservation Society. You believed that by erasing the Dutch land claims, you could clear the title for your development projects. That is called a conspiracy to commit fraud. I imagine the zoning board will be quite interested in the original records Thorne and Finch were so eager to bury." Sterling found his voice, though it was raspier than usual. "You can't prove a thing, Wolfe. My investment in the shop was legitimate. If Pym's staff was involved in extracurricular activities, that's their business, not mine. I'm a victim here, just like Pym, a victim who hired a private investigator to watch this house," I chimed in, leaning against the doorframe. "A victim whose signature is on the bank drafts that paid for those shipping crates in the basement. We've got the paper trail, Sterling. It doesn't lead to a dead man, it leads to your office on Wall Street." Wolfe ignored Sterling's spluttering and turned to Evelyn Thorne. "And you, Miss Thorne. Your ambition was your undoing. You were promised a shop of your own, funded by the surplus items you were helping Mr. Finch to liberate. You are a scholar of the word, yet you participated in its desecration. Your testimony will be required if you wish to avoid a cell in Bedford Hills." Evelyn didn't look up. She simply nodded, a single tear tracing a path through the ink smudge on her cheek. "And finally, Mr. Finch," Wolfe said, his voice gaining a sharp, cold edge. "You are the primary architect. You used the threat of fire to coerce Mr. Pym, a man who considered you a friend before your death. You invaded my home. You attempted to leverage the secrets of the dead to enslave the living. You will find that the walls of a prison are much less accommodating than the crates in a bookshop basement." Finch finally sat. He looked smaller now, the translucent quality of his skin making him look fragile, like a ghost that was finally fading out. "The ledger. The real one. Does it truly contain what I found?" "It contains the truth," Wolfe said. "It shows that the foundation of this city's wealth was built on a series of predatory loans and expired leases. It shows that the names on the portraits in those limestone mansions belong to the descendants of clerks and debt collectors who overstepped their authority. It is a messy, unheroic, and entirely accurate accounting. It is exactly what you feared it was, and exactly what it needs to be." Wolfe rang the bell for Fritz. The sound of the chime felt like a gavel. "Archie, the police are waiting in the vestibule with Saul. See to it that Mr. Finch and Mr. Sterling are escorted to their vehicles. Miss Thorne and Mr. Crane may remain for a moment to provide their formal statements to the stenographer." As I moved to gather them up, I looked at Pym. The old man was staring at Wolfe with a look of profound, bewildered gratitude. He was a man who had seen his world end and begin again in the space of an hour. The interrogation was over, but the air in the office was still thick with the weight of the secrets that had been dragged into the light. I led Finch and Sterling toward the door, feeling the cold March wind from the hallway as the police moved in. The librarian was going back into the silence, but this time he wouldn't have any books for company. The office had cleared, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy with the scent of old dust and the lingering ozone of a spent thunderstorm. Pym sat motionless, staring at the empty space where the man he had once known as Thomas Finch had stood. "Evelyn Thorne," and Marcus Crane were in the dining room, their voices a low, rhythmic murmur as they spoke to the stenographer I'd summoned. Wolfe had not moved from his chair. He sat with his eyes closed, his fingers tracing the edge of the desk as if reading the room's history through his skin. "The librarian was a perfectionist, Archie," Wolfe said, his voice barely more than a whisper. His failure was not in his research, but in his inability to account for the human variable. He believed that once he had the ledger, he had the city. He did not realize that a book is only as powerful as the consensus that agrees to believe in it. I leaned against the desk watching him. "You knew the book he was holding was a fake before he even stepped out of the wall. How? I saw you and Pym in the kitchen last night, but I didn't see you making a first edition forgery." Wolfe opened one eye, a glint of sardonic amusement visible. Mr. Pym did not need to forge the entire volume. He merely needed to provide a cover and a few aged pages that looked convincing in the dim light of a secret passage. The librarian's own arrogance provided the rest. He saw what he expected to see. He believed he was the only one capable of such a deception, and therefore he was blind to the possibility that I would use his own tactics against him. "But the key," I said. "The one in the Valentine's manual. You said it was for the coal chute." "It was," Wolfe said, "but its placement was the masterstroke. It wasn't left by Marcus Crane in a fit of conscience. It was left by Finch himself. He wanted us to find it. He wanted us to think we were one step behind him, racing toward a locker at Grand Central while he was safely tucked behind my bookshelves. He was directing our movements, or so he thought. He provided the clue to ensure we would be in this office, assembled and expectant at the precise moment he chose to make his entrance." I whistled softly. "So he staged his own capture." "He staged his own triumph," Wolfe corrected. "He intended to reveal himself, threaten the ledger, and extort the silence of everyone in this room. He would have walked out of here with Sterling's money and the city's secrets. But he did not account for the fact that I do not race. When he provided the key, I did not go to the station. I went to the kitchen. I spoke with Mr. Pym about the physical properties of the ledger, its weight, its binding, the specific scent of its decay. And then I had Fritz find a suitable substitute from the discard pile in the basement." Wolfe shifted his weight, the chair groaning in sympathy. "The final manipulation, however, was not the book. It was the surveillance. He knew Saul Panzer was outside. He used that knowledge to convince himself that he was the one in control, watching the watchers. He felt safe inside these walls because he believed he had bypassed our defenses. He did not realize that I had invited him in the moment I left the coal chute unlocked the second time." "You let him back in?" I asked, my eyebrows heading for my hairline. "I ensured the avenue was available," Wolfe said. "A man like Finch, once he has discovered a secret path, will always use it again. It provides him with a sense of intellectual superiority. By allowing him to trespass again, I kept him exactly where I wanted him, contained within the architecture of this house. He spent the night believing he was a ghost haunting my library, when in fact he was a specimen in a jar." The front door opened and closed. Saul Panzer walked into the office, looking tired but satisfied. He handed me a small, heavy object wrapped in a silk handkerchief. I unwrapped it and found the real ledger of the 5. Its leather was cracked and it smelled of damp earth and centuries of forgotten debts. "Found it where you said, Mr. Wolfe," Saul said. "Tucked inside one of those Empire preservation crates in the shop's basement." Finch had already moved it there days ago. He was never going to bring the real thing here. He just wanted to use the threat of it to break us. Wolfe didn't reach for the book. He looked at it with a mixture of respect and distaste. "The truth is often a very small, very dusty thing, Saul. Thank you. See that it is delivered to the district attorney personally. I want a receipt signed in triplicate." As Saul left, I looked at the ledger. It was the heart of the whole mess. The reason Pym's shop was threatened, the reason Sterling was a criminal, and the reason a dead man had come back to life. It was just a book, but in the hands of the librarian, it had almost been a weapon. The reveal wasn't for them, was it? I asked. The suspects. You did it for Finch. You wanted to show him that he wasn't the only one who could read between the lines. I did it for the record, Archie, Wolfe said, his voice regaining its usual brusque tone. A man who attempts to edit history for his own profit is a man who must be corrected. The librarian was a poor editor. He forgot that in any story the ending must be earned, not stolen. Wolfe looked at the clock. It is nearly lunch. Tell Fritz we are ready. And Archie, make sure Mr. Pym is informed that his shop is secure. I believe he will find the air on 4th Avenue much easier to breathe now that the ghosts have been evicted. I went to the dining room to deliver the news, feeling the tension finally dissolve. The past was back in its place. The librarian was in custody, and the brownstone was once again a fortress of predictable comforts. But as I looked back at Wolfe, still staring at the empty air where the secrets had been, I knew he was already looking for the next footnote. The aftermath of the librarian's fall was marked by a return to the meticulous, rhythmic silence that defined the brownstone. By Friday evening, the police had finally finished their cataloguing of the office. Sterling was out on a bond that would have bought a small island, and Thomas Finch was being held in a psychiatric ward for observation, a fate he likely found more insulting than a standard cell. Arthur Pym had departed an hour ago, his step lighter than I had ever seen it, carrying with him the assurance that his vault was once again a repository for history rather than a source of blackmail. I was in the office, finishing the tedious task of wiping down the shelves where Finch had hidden. The secret panel had been reset, the Valentine's manual was back in its rightful place, and the chalk dust had been banished by the combined efforts of a vacuum cleaner and my own sense of order. Wolfe was in his chair, the evening beer at his elbow, watching the light fade over the West 35th Street skyline. "The ledger is in the vault at the DA's office," I said, dropping into my chair. "Saul says the paperwork is a mile high. Sterling's lawyers are already trying to claim he was a victim of Finch's psychological manipulation, but with the bank drafts and the shipping receipts, they'll have a hard time making it stick. Evelyn Thorne is talking herself hoarse to get a reduced sentence, and Marcus Crane is looking for a teaching job in the Midwest. All in all, a clean sweep." Wolfe did not look at me. He was staring at the space where the facsimile ledger had sat, his expression one of heavy philosophical distance. "A clean sweep, Archie, is a cosmetic term. The mess remains in the memories of those involved. Mr. Pym will never look at his shelves again without wondering if a shadow is looking back. Mr. Sterling will find that while he may buy his freedom, he cannot buy back the reputation of a man who pays for the destruction of the truth." "Well, you got your fee," I reminded him. "The annotated Federalist papers. Pym delivered it this afternoon. It's on the table in the hallway, waiting for you to find a spot for it. I'd say that's a fair trade for 2 days of domestic disruption and a bit of coal dust in the basement." Wolfe grunted. "A fair trade? History is never traded fairly, Archie. It is always bought at the expense of someone's peace of mind. That volume is a masterpiece of political thought, yet it was used as a down payment on a detective's services to stop a man from burning a different set of records. The irony is as thick as the binding." Fritz appeared in the doorway, his face clear of the tension that had gripped him since the cleansing threat began. He announced that dinner was served, a Canneton à l'orange that had been occupying his attention since noon. The scent of roasted duck and caramelized citrus drifted into the office, a fragrant signal that the crisis was officially over. As we moved into the dining room, Wolfe took his seat with a slow, deliberate grace. He spent a moment adjusting his napkin, his eyes fixed on the silver. The transition from investigator to gourmet was a ritual I never tired of watching. It was the way he purged the world's ugliness through the appreciation of something perfect. "Rare editions, Archie," Wolfe said, picking up his fork. "The world is obsessed with the rarity of the object. They value the first printing, the unique annotation, the signature of the dead. They forget that the true value lies in the endurance of the thought. Thomas Finch believed that by possessing the physical ledger, he possessed the power to change what happened in 1639. He mistook the ink for the event. He nearly pulled it off, I said, helping myself to the asparagus. If he hadn't tried to play games with you, he'd be sitting in a boardroom right now, telling some Van Horn or Stuyvesant what to do with their zoning rights. His mistake wasn't a lack of research, it was a surplus of ego. Ego is the natural byproduct of a life spent in the shadows, Wolfe murmured, his voice softening as he tasted the duck. A man who spends too much time with books begins to believe he can write his own reality. He forgets that the world outside the library is governed by appetites, not footnotes. He did not account for your curiosity or my refusal to be hurried. He thought he was a librarian, but he was merely a clerk who had lost his way. The meal proceeded in the kind of comfortable, heavy silence that always followed a successful reveal. We didn't talk about Sterling or the fake ledger. We talked about the quality of the oranges and the merits of copper cookware. For Wolfe, the case was a closed chapter, a problem that had been solved and therefore no longer existed. As we finished, Wolfe sat back, a look of profound, albeit temporary, contentment on his face. He accepted a small glass of cognac from Fritz and looked at me over the rim. The cost of rare editions, Archie, is not measured in dollars. It is measured in the effort required to keep them from those who would use them as a shield for their own inadequacies. We have ensured that the history of this city remains a matter of public record, however messy that record may be. It is a small victory, but a necessary one. I grinned, picking up my coffee. And we got a first edition J out of it. Not a bad way to end the week. I think I'll take tomorrow off and see a ball game. I've had enough of the 17th century to last me a lifetime. Wolfe sipped his cognac, his eyes already drifting toward the ceiling. Do as you wish, Archie, but make sure the secret panel is properly oiled before you leave. I find I do not care for the sound of its hinges. It reminds me too much of the way a man steps out of the dark when he thinks he has nothing left to lose. I nodded, knowing that by morning the librarian would be just another story told over a beer at the corner bar, while the master of the brownstone would be back with his orchids, looking for the next rare thing to protect.